Now, the 5 days of cross-border violence shows no signs of abating, but caught in the crossfire, the residents of Gaza, air raids and shelling have damaged homes and schools. As Palestinians now escape on foot to seek refuge in United Nations schools, over 200 housing units have been destroyed in the Gaza Strip, with access to clean water, sanitation and healthcare now hindered. Fleeing families were seen arriving at UN schools in pickup trucks, on donkeys and some even on foot, like I mentioned, hauling their children and their belongings.
تطلع هيك بتلاقي قصف، تيجي هيك بتلاقي قصف، طيارات فوقينا، الدبابة بتخبط، الزورق بخبط، مش عارفين نتحرك ولا عارفين نروح. الأطفال بيصرخوا، النسوان بتصرخ، الزلام بتصرخ، يعني من يوم ما انخلقت ما شفتش أسوأ من هاي الليلة في حياتي.
كنا بدنا نطلع بالليل، ضلت الزنانات تقصف والبراميل يقصفوا علينا لما انتفج النهار، لمينا حالنا ما صدقنا نطلع من الدار واجينا نجري على المدارس. هاي كل اللي ولا واحد ولا استوعبنا شيء من لم من صرخة الأولاد، هم يصرخوا ويصوتوا بدهم يطلعوا واحنا بنرجف عليهم. أكثر من هيك لا. بالمهم صحينا لقينا الدنيا دمار عندنا كلها ورا، فيش شيء عندنا مليح.
With the bombing intensifying at night, many of them could not escape their homes. As dawn broke over Gaza, families then rushed to UN schools to escape the shelling.
حسينا كأنه فيلم رعب وأمر من فيلم رعب. تشوف تطلع الشرار يعدي في الدار، القصف والمجر، مش قادرين نتحرك، مش قادرين نطلع. أولادي حطناهم أنا
In the town of Beit Lahiya, residents gathered to mourn the death of a family who were killed after an Israeli warplane reduced a building to rubble. Heavy bombardment in the strip has toppled at least 3 high-rise apartment buildings, shelling some areas with tanks stationed near the border. Israeli fighter jets also bombed Gaza's National Production Bank building, claiming that it is a part of the Hamas financial infrastructure. Now, the Gaza Strip is home to around 2 million Palestinians. It is described as one of the most densely populated areas in the world and has been often called the focal point of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, the enclave is currently witnessing its most intense fighting since 2014. Over 130 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza so far. 830 others have been wounded in the current hostilities. And earlier we spoke with Noor O'Day. She is a Palestinian Legislative Council candidate and founding member of Democratic National Assembly in 2012. Ms. O'Day became Palestine's first female government spokesperson. Listen in. How do you assess the situation on ground, and what can you tell us about the broader implications of these clashes?
Well, the situation on the ground is simply tragic. You have 2.5 million Palestinians in Gaza who are under siege and occupation, who have no shelters to seek safety in, who have been pummeled with bombardment, constant bombardment from Israeli jet planes. And so far, we've lost at least 16 children, approximately 6 women, and 1 disabled man. Those were among the nearly 70 Palestinians killed in Gaza alone. And on the ground in the West Bank, the situation is not any less tense. Israeli measures and brutalization continues in occupied Jerusalem, as well as in other cities around the West Bank. Nightly raids continue to escalate, as do settler attacks on Palestinian towns and villages and neighborhoods in Jerusalem and inside Israel. So all in all, the totality of this of the situation is an alliance, if you will, an exchange of roles between Israeli settlers who are right-wing and racist and march down the streets chanting death to Arabs, and Israeli occupying forces that use all the military power and might at Israel's disposal, and it's a military superpower, as we all know, especially in the region, against a population that is basically defenseless and has nowhere to go.
All right. Also, now the UN Security Council will hold another emergency meeting to discuss the escalating conflict. What can we expect from that?
Well, unfortunately, the last time less than 24 hours ago, the Security Council met. It was the United States that prevented the adoption of even a statement on the issue, and several countries, including Ireland, for example, expressed their frustration with this obstructive U.S. role. The United States has so far chosen not to exercise its expected role of leadership in the region, and the only thing we've heard are expressions of solidarity and support with Israel, and no semblance of even recognition that Palestinians too not only have a right to protection and self-defense, but they also have rights under international law as an occupied population. Israel remains the occupying power. It is violating all tenets of international law in the way it is employing power and force against Palestinians in Gaza and across the occupied West Bank.
Right. And speaking of the role of the United States, what can you tell us about the role of the international community as a whole? We know that, and as you just mentioned, that Joe Biden has thrown his support behind Israel. So what do you make of the extent of the impact of repeated international calls for calm?
Well, regrettably, these calls, unless they are coupled with measures of accountability, unless Israel feels that it will be held accountable for these violations, that it would pay a financial or political price for continuing to violate Palestinian rights, to violate international law, to brutalize the Palestinian people, then it has no incentive, really, to stop what it's doing. In fact, it will continue to feel encouraged to continue acting with impunity so long as it receives all this financial, political support from the United States without any other actors stepping in. We've heard from elected officials, even in the United States, calling on the Congress to, and in the UK, and even in Canada, and I would assume as well some representatives in India, saying that this situation is untenable, that countries have to step in and take individual measures, like conditioning their cooperation and agreements with Israel to its adherence to international law, stopping military aid, making sure that the markets in these countries do not accept settlement products produced on stolen Palestinian land in contravention of international law, really in a commission of a war crime under the Rome Statute. So there are many measures that individual countries can take. India, for example, can play a very significant role, a moral leadership role in putting the brakes on this Israeli intransigence and impunity by making sure that its relations, its considerable financial and military cooperation with Israel are conditioned upon respect for international law. Otherwise, there's no incentive to de-escalate. There's no incentive to end the occupation, which is at the core, really, of all these escalations. We have to remember that the daily life of Palestinians is a life of violence, even if you don't see it on TV. It's a life of being subjugated to a foreign military occupation that controls every aspect of your life and uses force and brutality and racist laws to maintain that occupation. So there's nothing calm about returning to before this escalation, as for Palestinians at the very least.
All right, Ms. Noorudeh, thank you so much for joining us with your inputs on that. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.